pillar to the legitimacy of a democracy. It is sometimes the only public advocate that stands in the way of state monopolization of power inside states. We believe that when the fundamental goal of the media is to challenge the authority of actors, to challenge the authority of the state, and to be the last stand for the people that are in these societies, we believe it is fundamentally, principally wrong, as well as practically wrong, to allow the state to have a monopoly of power in the media. This is why we are against the state owning these media corporations. So before I get into my argumentation, I have two things to do. First of all, I'm going to explain our stance in the debate. Second of all, get into definitions. And then first of all, I'm going to talk about the principle and the purpose of democracy and the media intertwined, and how they fundamentally have separate goals. And then secondly, talking about the quality of the media and the mechanisms that these governments are going to use in order to have a monopoly on the media. So first of all, our stance. We are against majority parties and entire governments owning media organizations. We support a variety of other actors owning media corporations, which can include individuals. We also believe that democratic states and political parties should not be allowed to sponsor, donate, or subsidize these organizations because we believe that is an extension of our principle. But we'd also like to specify that this debate is not about the mechanism of how we would shut down current government control of media-run organizations. It is about whether or not we prefer a world, and we believe that a world is more fair, that does not have these media organizations controlled by the government. Also acknowledge that both sides in this debate have to play with a variety of actors, and that we acknowledge that not every state has an incentive to directly control their media. But it's not about individuals controlling their media. It is about the potential for these governments to maintain absolute power and authority, not only in the status quo, but in the future. Before I get into my definitions, sure.
Would you allow governments to regulate private media outlets and issue press releases?
We think that that it's fundamentally wrong for the government to organize how the media can act in specific ways. We do think that there is, however, a distinction between the government sending out a press release and a government owning a media corporation. We think that the distinction is that a media corporation is viewed as a check and balance and a form of absolute knowledge coming from like the society rather than an individual government. We think that it's a little bit different under their side of the house. So first of all, we are acknowledging this House as democratic states, both fledgling and developed democracies, and media organizations are organizations that broadcast information and journalism to the public. We think that this is fundamentally organizations that follow the principles of journalism as well. So first of all, getting into our principle. We think that the purpose of democracy is to represent the majority of citizens. We believe that there are three key pillars that are associated with this. First of all, there is legitimacy, both perceived and actual, that is required in order for a government to be legitimately democratic. Secondly, there must be checks and balances on this government. This is what leads to accountability that ensures that a developing or ensured democracy can be considered accountable. And there must be free and fair elections that are reported on and that are identified as free and fair elections in the public. We think that the media is supposed to be providing information and acting as a check and balance, which is actually fundamentally against the purpose of governments, which is to represent the majority. We think it is immoral to use taxpayer dollars to fund this sort of media organization that not every single citizen is requiring, using, or supporting, and don't see their views reflected in. We think that there are a few reasons why the media should not serve this goal. First of all, we think that it is uncomparable with the goals of democracy. It should be able to report on the decisions and be able to make sure that it's catering to as many people as possible. This also means reporting on minority groups, for example, something that a government that is democratic doesn't typically focus on. We also think that the goal of governments is fundamentally to get re-elected. So we think it's absolutely critical that the media remains a separate part of that organization. We think that there are two goals of the media. First of all, to maintain information that ensures there's fair and free, to ensure that individuals can make informed choices in their day-to-day lives. This means like small choices as well as big choices like choosing who to elect in government. We also think that the fundamental goal of the media is to act as a check on authority. This is the fundamental principle that we are pushing on our side of the house. Why does this not happen if governments are able to control the quality of media? I'll take you actually, go ahead.
Ma'am, some people did not vote for the governments that happened to be elected. By your logic, does that mean that they don't need to pay income taxes to the government?
No, I don't think that's true because the government provides lots of other services that are universal to everybody. We think that that is a principle that stands on our side of the house. That's not really comparative for you to say. Okay, on the quality of media, we think that there are several unique mechanisms that governments have an incentive to use and are actually likely to use in order order to enforce that the media is only pushing their narrative. First of all, the mechanism I already mentioned is that governments want to get re-elected. We think that this is specifically problematic in states where nascent democracies and individuals have a large degree of power. My second speaker is going to be talking about this more specifically in authoritarian states or states moving towards authoritarianism from democracies. We think that there are 5 main mechanisms that they can use to control the media. First of all, subsidizing mass amounts of money. So this is also for governments that are subsidizing but also owning. We think that this has 2 key impacts. First of all, that threatening to remove funding can mean that you can extort these media companies into doing what you want them to do. That can mean preventing them from reporting on key issues that you think are a little bit too sensitive for your government to deal with. But secondly, in less completely extortive cases, where the government doesn't explicitly say, we don't want you to report on these things, there is always the explicit knowledge that the government is the one that is owning your media company, and if you start doing things that are anti-government, they may start changing leadership, for example, which is why you're likely to make decisions that would be applicable in what your government would want to enforce, even if they are not completely correct. Secondly, they can control the kinds of reporters and reporting that goes on in these states. We think an example of this is the BJP, where there was a reporter that was harshly criticizing the BJP and she miraculously disappeared and was never heard from again. We think that the government is able to do this even more when there are no other free news organizations in the state, and I'll be going on to prove why that happens. Secondly, we think that it can prevent the kind of journalism that occurs within these states. Investigative journalism is incredibly important in order to undermine the power structures of government and the power structures of other bodies and corporations. When a government can say this is anti-our values and you are not allowed to do investigative reporting, this has a few harms. An example of this is government-controlled media in Brazil was accused of covering up President Miguel Torra's corruption scandals, even though the media had received video evidence of him in these corruption scandals and they chose not to report on it because it was media controlled. Thirdly, they can set the mandate of the media. This is the kinds of reporting that actually can occur within the media, the kinds of stories they do. Fourthly, and this is actually crucial on their side, they have to respond to this, they have the capacity to shut down and crowd out other media sources. When the government can extra fund specific kinds of media that they own, that means that they can crowd out smaller media companies that they don't want to have a say within the government. This means that they can actively control the free speech of individuals, but also the amount of information that is getting out to the public. We think that there are lots of impacts of this. One, we think that states can emphasize their own policy. This can be things like demonizing immigrants or misframing opposition parties to try to push their own narrative. They can try to lie to the public in a variety of other ways. They can try to have profit incentives and push these companies because they know they can shut them down. Fundamentally, on our side of the house, we recognize that even if there is not a threat in every single media in every single state, it is never justifiable to give a government absolute control of the narrative that occurs within a society. And that when you do that, you are no longer a democratic state because you are removing the ability of individuals to make decisions and you're removing the legitimacy of a state to actually function. We are proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the first speaker of the opposition for their speech, and I'd like to invite the first speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
Let's not pretend that the comparative and propositions world is a world without any kind of political bias, because there will still be interference by political biases. The difference is you cannot formally trace these alliances. When you have people like Sean Hannity, who die at the White House every single week with Donald Trump, who then goes on to write articles about him in his praise, or people like Rupert Murdoch, who continue to hold strong political links, it's just untrue to argue that our side is the only side with political links. We think it's far worse on your side when you consider it like a point of information you have no regulation, so your side is the one that has to stand for a poor quality of news. What is our stance in opposition? First, we believe that democratic states should own and run media organizations. Second, this does not mean that we have a state monopolization of media as their side claims. To be clear, we will not ban private media organizations because we envision a world where private media organizations run alongside government-run public media organizations. And to be clear, this is perfectly consistent with our burden in this motion before they tell us that we're running a soft stance. Because our argument is that government-run media organizations provide a unique benefit in complementing private media organizations. This is because they aren't profit-oriented. It means that A, they provide low-cost access to good quality programming, and B, there is fact-checking to ensure that content is responsibly produced. All of which can't happen in their world because they have no regulations whatsoever on the quality of media that's being produced. Third, this policy will run just like any other public utility service that governments provide in all cases, and it will be run by civil servants. It's important to recognize that this creates a degree of independence from the political state of governance. Because the government provides the money, but there is obviously a difference between the incumbent party running the country and the concept of a state and its independent civil service. This already happens in the status quo today. Public schools are funded by government. But independent civil servants set the curriculum. So the role of government probably comes from the fact that governments can more stringently regulate the public media organizations through fact-checking, for instance. Fourth, how will the content of these public media outlets be decided? Governments may create their own news programs that are often held to higher standards. They may also buy over licensing rights to popular TV shows and movies. They can also focus on local programming. We're going to forward three arguments. First, that our side increases access to media. Second, that we raise the quality of media. And third, in our second speaker, that we increase public trust in news outlets. Before that, let's deal with that case. The first argument they bring to us is a moral defense on whether or not it's immoral to use taxpayer money to fund the media. We think this makes no sense because in every single government, we use public funds, but it doesn't mean that every single person benefits from it. We fund public schools, but we can also have people going to private schools. So this argument simply does not make any sense. So that all of the five mechanisms, all assume there are no other news sources on our side. I've proven to you my policy why that's simply not true. Second thing they bring to us is this argument about checks and balances to prevent government outreach. Before I go on, yes.
Would you allow governments to monitor their own elections?
No, obviously not, because I just told you in every democracy there is a split between an independent civil service and the government running the country. Deal with my analysis on that. Back to my argument. So they want to talk about, clearly, not really democratic states, because I think in first speaker they try to muddy the waters. So let's deal with this. In democratic states, there are institutional checks to ensure that we do have checks and balances. First, we often have a robust opposition party presence. So if the Trump government manipulates the media, I'm pretty sure the Democratic Party won't just stand idly. Second, we have the check balance of the ballot box, so clearly the people won't stand for this manipulation. And third, we can also have constitutional constraints on the government powers. So their side is really debating on the margins when they say that they want to talk about democratic states who are sliding into autocracy. I heard that in the first speech. I find it incredibly incredulous. Because this argument, this debate, has to be about democracies that are truly functioning. You can't muddy the waters like that. Deal with your burden. But even if we accept their argument about why governments are self-interested, it's precisely why states will try to be as neutral as possible. Because if having hugely skewed news means that you alienate a huge base of political support that gets people to have backlash against you. This deals with the argument about a BJP reporter who was fired because obviously there was huge backlash and protest on the street when people found out the government is manipulating media organizations. On to my first argument then on how our side increases access to media. The thrust of this argument is that profit incentive of private media decreases access to media. Why? Recognize that media competition to lower prices among private media organizations is a myth. The first reason for this is that the same people own many media organizations. So for instance, Rupert Murdoch, who has a global media enterprise who owns Fox News, Sky News, and The Sun, for instance. Second, even if there are many media outlets, they often collude to set prices very high. So these two reasons show that there is a lack of competition. This is important because no competition means you have no incentive to lower prices to ensure that media is accessible to many people in society. So even if some private news organizations have good quality journalism, they are often out of reach to everyday people on the ground. And the reason why they do this is because of their profit incentive. Because they need to cover the cost of their operations and make profit by charging high subscription fees. What are the impacts? First, this means that good quality news outlets and news media are out of reach because of paywalls, for instance. So cable TV subscriptions are often hugely expensive. It costs $200 to register for access to cable TV to access CNN, NBC, and ABC in America. And you need to pay monthly fees on top of that. Imagine how the average Joe is going to access news on their side. But even in the case of online news, there are often paywalls. So almost every single news outlet charges money to access these articles. People like New York Times and Foreign Policy all collect money. The second impact is what you have access to as a regular person is instead low quality programming. Because if private media organizations want to be free but still in a profit, they have to have advertisements, for instance. They have to have clickbait articles, all of which decreases the quality of news on their side. What is the comparative on our side? We have state-run media organizations that are far more accessible because they are free. As I've told you, the provision of state media will function like any other provision of public utilities. There will be no profit incentive here. So our side functions really like how governments already provide private schools that already provide public schools as compared to private schools that tend to charge far higher school fees. So our side ensures access. Why is this important? First, because we ensure access to accurate news, and secondly, because we have a diverse range of news and media like TV shows. Second argument about how our side enriches the quality of media. So what are the structural flaws of private media? We think they are often very sensationalist, and that's why we need a counterweight of the governments in this arena. Because the profit incentive forces the hands of private media. They have to fill in a 24-hour news cycle. And this is what leads them to over-sensationalize news stories to get more clicks on their pages. They have to fill a 24-hour news cycle race to get stories. That's what gives them less fact-checking in the status quo. And a good example of this is the 2016 presidential election, where we focus on the clothes of Hillary Clinton or her email scandals as opposed to substandard policy platforms of different people running for political office. So, people in their world are currently being forced to watch extremely partisan news because of the incentive of the media to over-sensationalize these news. This is what contributed to the huge political polarization that characterizes today's political scenes. Our side changes this in a few ways. First, we cater to people who want neutral programming, and recognize that on our side, governments have every incentive to be even-handed, and recognize that existing inclinations to consume sensationalist news is not inherent in people. The only reason we do so is because we have been fed a diet of this news, and that's what has led us to consume this news. It's not because we inherently only want to read sensationalist news. Second, in the long term, we change the diet of people and the news that people are being fed, and that's why our side ensures there is less political polarization and more constructive discourse that exists in society today. For all of these reasons, public information should not be monopolized by private profit. We stand very firmly in opposition.
7 minutes, 57 seconds. I'd like to thank the first speaker of the opposition for their speech, and I'd like to thank the speaker for the opposition to deliver their speech.
Ready? I want to start the speech with two key clarifications that are very important in adjudicating this round. First, both sides acknowledge that there are more private media organizations along with their stance. The distinction between the two sides then is that we would only want privately run media organizations versus their side would want a state-run one and a coexistence with the private-run ones. This means two things. Firstly, that you should judge this debate based on which side brings more persuasive, unique benefits or harms of state-run media on their side. Our side has uniquely told you that the state-run narrative is toxic, and oftentimes it has a disproportionate power to crowd out other media sources that they want to champion on their side of the house. Second, it means that when their major benefit that they hang their case on is cheaper, more accessible media, this is something that should be valued far less at the point in which if we can prove to you that private-run organizations also have the profit incentive to provide cheaper, accessible media, then their point falls. Their analysis about how news is so sensationalized on our side is a concession then. Because if it is not a concession, then a lot of sensationalization would happen on private-run medias and state-run medias on their side too. But if sensationalization somehow doesn't happen on their side, they're conceding to the fact that state-run media can crowd out private-run media sources and become the dominant force in there. That is the only scenario in which their benefit about sensationalization stands. Second clarification, the types of democracies that we're talking about in this debate. We recognize on side proposition that there's a spectrum, right? There are good, accountable ones in status quo. In these countries, citizens are more likely to be informed, they're more likely to reach out to other news sources before making up their political or social choices. That means that both the benefits and harms of both sides are mitigated slightly in this case. But let's look at the bad ones, the less accountable ones, the shaky ones. In these nascent and developing democracies, citizens are more likely to be coerced at the point in which the state has disproportionate power over those citizens. That's the point at which all our harms still stand, they have no benefits on their side of the house. Two questions to refute. First, what is the purpose of media? Second, how do we better democracy? First, what is the purpose of media? No thank you. We were a side that was against media censorship, and media that was true to the will of the people. We told you a lot about how the government can sway media by stopping the subsidization of it, by intimidating reporters, by intimidating the institution as a whole, by crowding out other media sources, by disproportionately subsidizing one media source and actually making that media source delegitimize other media sources. How we can't get investigative journalism on their side of the house. This was not responded to, and the only response that we get is, well, your side supports no regulation on private media sources at all. This is not what my first speaker said. Of course we can support things like a ban or a ban on like fake news or hate speech in the media sources. I think regulations at that point is fine. What did they bring to you under this idea of the purpose of media? First, that there should be good quality, cheap, media news that is accessible to all, and that the state is a unique actor that can provide this sort of media. First, I'm wondering why I can't just log on to NewYorkTimes.com and read the news from there. At the point in which state-run media and private-run media can both be accessible in the 21st century where we can access it on the internet, I don't see the problem with that. But second, if these private-run organizations are so motivated by profit incentives, they have every incentive to lower the prices as much as possible. Why? Because there are so many competitors. And competition means that news has elastic demand. That means that if prices go up, then there will be a disproportionate loss of audience that will go to alternatives that exist, like other cheaper media sources. But third, in the age that we live in today, where there's a rise of citizen journalism, and journalism that is very democratized and dispersed to other means, we don't think that accessibility is the benefit that you hang their case on their side of the house. Second, they talked about how news becomes better quality, how it's less sensationalized. I'll take you in 1 second. First, we still think that this news will be sensationalized by the state at the point in which they can sensationalize news media that is disadvantageous to the opposition parties or opposition political ideologies. But second, we can still support things like fact-checking. Go ahead.
Recognize that many mechanisms on your side, such as citizen journalism or alternative media outlets, means that arguments on government abuse on your side are unlikely to be the case on both sides of the house.
Okay, so the question is, in the context, like I explained in my introduction, in the context that other sources of media exist, which side brings more unique harms on their side of the house? We're saying that if state runs a media organization, they're more likely to take power away from things like citizen journalism. They have to defend that harm on their side of the house. Second question then, how do we better democracy? We told you a very strong principle, that state has power right now, and without checks and balances, power can beget power in the future. And the media is a unique mechanism to provide this check on this powerful force that we call our state. That the state's power is illegitimate unless the people's vote is informed. All they said was, well, these states will still be very neutral because they don't want to alienate the voting population. This is unresponsive to the nuance that we gave in first speaker, which is that they will alienate a minority of the population in order to strengthen their support for the majority. That is something that they need to respond to on their side of the house. Third argument, how we prevent backsliding. This policy is the best way to prevent democratic states from reverting back to authoritarianism. Why is this argument important? Recognize that democracy is the prerequisite of any benefit that their side brings to you in today's case. That means that if there are fewer democratic states that exist on their side of the house, then their benefits are significantly reduced. There are a number of mechanisms for this. Firstly, polarization of the media. If a state that has the incentive to garner more political support in their own population owns a media source, they have every incentive to demonize opposition parties, otherize a particular ethnicity, race, or social class, and delegitimize other political ideologies. We see this currently in the Spanish government when the government-sponsored media demonizes Catalonians as traitors and delegitimizes what they want in the political sphere. The impact is this: there's increased hate and segregation in society, but there's increased instability and precedent for the government to take stronger control of the public. Notice all the authoritarian states that were once democracies back in World War II. Mussolini, Hitler, all these people rose to power, and their first step was to take control of the media. Before, the media was not run by the state, and they had diverse sources of discourse. Second, they attacked rival institutions that put the government in check. This looks like attacking the legitimacy of the judicial system, or the judges on the judicial system, or the parliamentary system as a whole, by spreading toxic rhetoric about how it's a constant deadlock, how it's inefficient, so that the public can be brainwashed into thinking that efficiency is what they should prioritize. But the second, they crowd out other media sources. A, economically, by giving them subsidies, by buying up other sources and encouraging them to collude with each other. But second, intimidating them from the state, or corrupting them by giving them money in the back door. That means that there is fewer media organizations to challenge the power of the state. But third, they often use the media to mobilize the population against an exterior threat. In times of military crisis, a war, or a campaign, these state-run media sources spread propaganda that say we need to unite and we need to support the government against this exterior threat. But fourth, they stifle political dissent at the point in which they can selectively feature news sources of dissent, where they can shut out instances of revolt, violence by the state, and imprisonment of political dissenters. The comparative is this: these governments are bad on both sides of the house. Side opposition will give them a powerful tool that they can reach out to the vast majority of the population so that they can brainwash them, they can influence them, and control them. On our side, we say no to that. If the government wants to be authoritarian, they have to be met by dissent, counter-narratives, and increased dissent by the public. We're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the second speaker of the proposition, and would like to invite the second speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
So second prop clarifies that they want regulation because governments can ban fake news. The reason why the concession is important in adjudicating the debate is because they concede that the risk of government overreach is not a reason to stop doing something that is practically good. I can imagine plenty of governments manipulating what fake news is like and creating their own version of reality. The reason why they still stand for that is because they admit that government overreach is not a risk that outweighs immediately all of the practical ways in which this policy takes place. Now, the third speaker would probably say this debate can't be about extreme governments where governments manipulate the definition of fake news. That's exactly our point. This debate cannot be about extreme governments that manipulate the media outlets they run and own in such a pernicious manner. They must deal with the majority of where this debate takes place. They have not done that. I want to talk about two things. First, the principle. Second, the practical. First, the principle. Note that principle is not actually a principle for government separation. It's more a principle for a political intervention in the news outlets that you have. Recognize, our first response is that this policy and this principle doesn't actually fall to either side, because we pointed out that that politicization and the intervention of political interest is going to happen on their side. Look, Rupert Murdoch, who literally owns so many global media outlets, literally donates thousands of dollars to the Republican Party every year. I would suggest that they don't win this principle either, because it is not true that in the majority of cases, they cut out any politicization of news. Examples we gave you in the first speaker, not dealt with. Our second response is that, obviously, outside cannot be standing for totalitarian states. So I think it's pretty telling that the second speaker's argument was examples of Hitler and Mussolini. So like somewhere in their prep, they decided that it would be fair to make opposition stand for North Korea. But evidently, I don't think the CAP wanted us to stand for North Korea when they set this motion. Obviously, we told you that the point is that governments can own and run media outlets. But this is not about taking over every single media outlet. So their argument of how taking over every single media outlet is the first step to authoritarianism clearly does not apply. Because our policy is not taking over every media outlet. We believe in complementing complementary roles of each outlet. The more sensible line they raise is that, but you concede by the idea of sensationalization that the media outlet run by the government will become the dominant force. No, that's not true. If anything, we think we diversify the range of options people have to turn to. So if it's really so true that the government media outlet is so manipulative, then people will just choose to look at citizen journalism. Like they said governments will shut down citizen journalism. Exactly, that's our point. If you want to debate on the most autocratic of states, they will shut down citizen journalism every way. They will just shut down all media outlets on either side. So the debate clearly has to take place in states where governments allow private media organizations. And we think in these cases, private media organizations that have money, that have donors, for example, often can challenge government-run media outlets. So for instance, the BBC is a good example. I think, for example, the BBC is run by the British government, but there are also so many other private media organizations. In Britain, the reason why this stands in reality is because in reality, it is not just one dominant government media organization, but complementing all of these. So they say we don't deal with the 5 mechanisms. Yes, because the 5 mechanisms are undergirded by the common premise that governments are shutting out all common discourse. And anyway, if you believe in your 5 mechanisms, you cannot stand for regulation on fake news. Because equally, the idea of me threatening to not subsidize you equally applies to me threatening to sue you for fake news. So you concede that your 5 mechanisms are not a reason not to do our policy. Before I move on, sure.
If your best benefit is accessibility of the media, in your best countries where the democracy is very accountable, there's likely to be other sources that make news accessible.
Oh no, for example, we think many cases, and this nicely brings me on my second contention on access, okay? So I'll just rebut this point here. So they say a few things. The internet and citizen journalism. Our argument is that we want more good quality programming that is offered by governments. Look, the idea of citizen journalism, while sounding nice in practice, is often hugely unregulated in the status quo. We think it's a good thing when governments can fact-check their own media outlets rather than rely on citizen journalism, who, if you want to be a famous citizen journalist, tend to sensationalize their stories, as opposed to governments who are a lot more responsible. This is not a marginal benefit, as they say. We think it's a huge benefit when people on the ground aren't duped by fake media outlets that only want to sensationalize and create profit. Look, we admit there may be some good private media outlets, but our first biggest mechanism, not dealt with, is that many of these are out of the reach of the common people. The idea of how New York Times and The Economist have put up paywalls to access their articles online, leading to the contextualization of the internet. The idea of how if you want a cable TV subscription, you have to pay $100 a month to just get good movies on HBO. All of this means that media outlets are out of reach of the common man in terms of good quality programming. Particularly because if you recognize that if you're a profit-making media outlet who wants, for example, still remain free, you often depend on clickbait advertising. So we think that's a bad thing that decreases the quality of media outlets. Again, I don't get why they stand and say that this is an important thing that is a marginal benefit. Because fake news and the sensationalization of media literally changed the whole 2016 US presidential election. I think it's a huge impact on our side when we have practical benefits. Also note that they never actually dealt with our argument on the idea of sensationalism. And note that again, this kind of deals with their second speaker's argument on backsliding because one of their arguments was polarization as a tier of this. We told you how many people do want neutral programming, but the only reason why this doesn't stand currently is because we are fed a diet of sensationalism monopolized by many media outlets that believe in this sensationalism. On our side, we ensure that we can change the diet because government media outlets can, for example, fact-check, they can ensure there are neutral political shows, all arguments that were not dealt with. So again, they can't just call this a marginal practical benefit because then I can say that principle is a marginal principal benefit as well. They need to deal with our actual analysis of how we have huge benefit. My argument further pushes on this. My constructive argument is public trust in media outlets, and I'm going to show you why is it, and this note that this is my best ground, even if the best solution is good private media outlets, we encourage people to turn to these good private media outlets, whereas currently they distrust these good private media outlets on their side. The first thing I want to clarify is that our case certainly does not involve governments taking over everything in the media outlet. Like we clearly said in first, there is a difference between the civil service and the state that is run. And I think their POI on election bodies falls to us because democratic states run election bodies. The election body is still independent. Just because a democratic state runs something doesn't mean it's linked to the incumbent party. Similarly, we told you the idea of how public schools are run, but curriculums are not set by the party in power. It's very clearly an example that falls to our side. But note, even if we deal with their best case on the idea of governments that have overreached and are still trying to do this, we think it's much better on our side because we at least really delegitimize the rhetoric that currently stands that many outlets are owned by rich people who only care about liberal interests. We think the idea of an independent state-run entity on our side is more likely to appeal to, for example, supporters of Trump. Because currently supporters of Trump say that the liberal establishment controls these media outlets. Now, I know they're going to say, but on your side the establishment controls them as well. Before I move on to show you why that's not true, sure.
Which is a better comparative then? This media outlet is run by a liberal, or this media outlet is run by the liberal government?
Which is the whole point. You need to deal with our framing of how this is not run by the Liberal government, but run by the state as a civil service entity as a whole. So very clearly, you need to respond to that in your next speaker. Election bodies are run by the civil service. They are still run by the state, but they are not run by the incumbent party. So they are misconstruing this debate entirely. I'm not